July 26, 1942. Sidi Hanesh Airfield, North Africa, 2 hours before dawn. The desert night hung thick and moonless over the Libyan plateau, the air still holding the day's heat like a dying breath. Across the hard-packed sand, rows of German aircraft sat silent. Messerschmitt 109s, Junkers 88 bombers, Stuka dive bombers lined up with parade ground precision. Their metal skins gleamed faintly under the stars, each one representing months of German industrial output, thousands of man-hours of skilled labor, the concentrated wealth of the Reich's war machine. The Luftwaffe ground crew slept in their tents 200 meters from the flight line, confident in the security of their position deep behind Axis lines. They had no sentries posted on the perimeter. They had no reason to expect danger. The nearest British forces were supposed to be 100 miles away, exhausted and retreating after Rommel's victories at Gazala and Tobruk. The war, as far as these men knew, was progressing according to plan. Then came the sound. A low rumble at first, indistinct, perhaps mistaken for distant thunder, but thunder does not grow steadily louder. Thunder does not resolve into the unmistakable growl of multiple engines approaching at speed. By the time the first German sentry stumbled from his tent, fumbling with his rifle, it was already too late. From the darkness beyond the airfield's western perimeter, a column of vehicles emerged. 18 heavily armed jeeps moving in perfect formation, their weapons already manned and loaded. These were not conventional military vehicles. They bristled with Vickers K machine guns, Boys anti-tank rifles, and racks of small incendiary bombs. And the men who drove them were not conventional soldiers. They were the Special Air Service, and they had come to destroy an air base with nothing more than speed, audacity, and the element of absolute surprise. Lieutenant David Sterling sat in the lead jeep, his face wrapped in a sand-stained chamois, his eyes scanning the rows of aircraft ahead. He did not need to issue orders. His men knew their jobs. They had trained for this. They had refined the technique through a dozen smaller raids. But this was the operation that would prove whether their radical new approach to warfare could achieve something that conventional forces had failed to accomplish. The crippling of German air superiority in North Africa, as his driver accelerated toward the first row of parked aircraft. Sterling felt the weight of that moment settle over him. Everything the SAS had argued for, everything they had risked, would be validated or destroyed in the next 15 minutes. The jeep swept onto the airfield like a mechanized sandstorm, their machine guns opening fire in synchronized bursts that shattered the desert silence. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness, finding targets with practiced precision. The Vickers K guns, stripped from obsolete aircraft and mounted in pairs, fired at a combined rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. At point-blank range, they were devastating. Fuel tanks ruptured, cockpit canopies exploded, engine cowlings shredded under the onslaught. And then came the bombs, small Lewis bombs, each weighing less than 2 pounds, designed specifically for this purpose. The SAS raiders hurled them with almost casual precision as they drove past each aircraft, the incendiaries igniting fuel spills, transforming million Reichsmark fighters into funeral pyres. The Germans emerged from their tents into chaos. Some ran toward their aircraft, driven by instinct to protect them. Others scrambled for defensive positions, trying to organize a coherent response. But the SAS gave them no time. The jeeps moved in a coordinated pattern, one line attacking the northern row of aircraft, another sweeping the southern perimeter, a third suppressing any organized resistance from the German defensive positions. The entire formation moved like a single organism, each vehicle supporting the others, the attack proceeding with a fluidity that made it appear almost choreographed. In reality, it was the product of months of brutal training in the desert, of learning to operate as a unit without rigid command structures, of trusting each man to understand not just his role, but the entire operation's purpose. Within 12 minutes, 40 German aircraft were burning. 12 minutes. The SAS had achieved in a quarter of an hour what conventional bombing raids had failed to accomplish in months of operations. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, vanishing back into the desert darkness, leaving behind an inferno that could be seen for 30 miles in a German command structure that would spend the next several hours trying to comprehend what had just happened, to understand why this raid represented a catastrophic failure for the Luftwaffe, a one from which German air power in North Africa would never fully recover. One must first understand the strategic situation that made it possible and the revolutionary military thinking that conceived it. In the summer of 1941, the North African campaign had reached a critical juncture. Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps had pushed British forces back across Libya, threatening Egypt and beyond it, the Suez Canal. British generals understood that they faced not just a tactical problem, but a fundamental imbalance of combat power. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. German fighters and bombers operated with near impunity, striking British supply columns, supporting panzer advances, and making daylight movement dangerous for Allied forces. The Royal Air Force was outnumbered and outperformed. British bombers attempting to strike German airfields faced heavy losses to anti-aircraft fire and fighter interception, often achieving minimal damage in return. The conventional military wisdom held that airfields could only be attacked by aircraft, and that such attacks required overwhelming force to overcome defensive measures. But conventional wisdom had produced only conventional failures. The strategic problem remained unsolved: how to neutralize German air superiority when direct confrontation proved prohibitively costly. Into this deadlock walked Lieutenant David Stirling, a 25-year-old officer from the Scots Guards who had recently transferred to the Commandos and then to a small failed parachute unit called L Detachment. Stirling had been thinking about the problem from an entirely different angle. What if airfields didn't need to be attacked from the air? What if small teams of specially trained soldiers could infiltrate behind enemy lines, approach airfields on foot or by vehicle, and destroy aircraft on the ground using nothing more than explosives and small arms? The idea seemed absurd to most senior officers. Airfields were defended positions. They had guard posts, patrols, anti-aircraft batteries. Attempting to assault one with infantry, especially small teams, would be suicidal. But Stirling's genius lay in recognizing what the conventional thinkers missed. German airfields in North Africa were not actually well defended. The Luftwaffe had grown complacent. They operated hundreds of miles behind the front lines in territory they controlled. Their security measures focused on defending against air attack, anti-aircraft guns, fighter patrols, dispersal of aircraft. They did not expect and were not prepared for ground assault by infiltration teams. The airfield's very distance from British lines, which seemed to guarantee their security, actually created an opportunity. If a team could cross that distance undetected, they would find targets that were essentially unguarded. Stirling drafted a memo outlining his concept and, through a combination of audacity and luck, managed to present it directly to General Claude Auchinleck, the British Commander-in-Chief Middle East. Auchinleck, desperate for any solution to the Luftwaffe problem, authorized Stirling to form a new unit, L Detachment Special Air Service Brigade. The name was deliberately misleading, intended to suggest a parachute unit to confuse German intelligence. In reality, Stirling was creating something entirely new, a force designed specifically for deep penetration raids against high-value targets. The early operations were learning experiences purchased with blood. The first SAS parachute raid in November 1941 was a disaster. High winds scattered the teams, most men were injured on landing, and they achieved almost nothing. But Stirling adapted. If parachutes were unreliable, they would use vehicles. He partnered with the Long Range Desert Group, an existing reconnaissance unit with experience in desert navigation. The LRDG would transport SS teams to target areas, and the raiders would approach airfields on foot, plant bombs on aircraft, and escape before the Germans realized what was happening. This new approach proved devastatingly effective. In December 1941, Stirling's team struck multiple airfields, destroying dozens of German aircraft using nothing more than time-delayed bombs placed on fuel tanks and engine compartments. The Germans, discovering their aircraft destroyed hours after the raiders had disappeared into the desert, struggled to comprehend the new threat. How had the British penetrated so far behind lines? How had they avoided detection? Where were they now? The Luftwaffe began diverting resources to airfield security, guards, patrols, defensive positions. But this security came at a cost, requiring manpower and attention that could have been devoted to operations. By mid-1942, the SAS had refined their technique further. Working with the LRDG, they developed the concept of the Jeep raid, mounting machine guns on modified American Willys Jeeps and attacking airfields not by stealth, but by speed and overwhelming firepower. The idea seemed counterintuitive. Why announce your presence? Why engage in a firefight when you could plant bombs and escape undetected? But Sterling understood the psychological dimension. A stealth raid destroyed aircraft but left the defenders with some dignity. A jeep raid, driving directly onto an airfield, shooting up aircraft in plain view, and escaping before the defenders could organize a response, inflicted psychological damage along with material losses. It demonstrated that German airfields, even deep in supposedly secure territory, were not safe. It created fear and doubt. The men selected for the SAS were not typical soldiers. Sterling's recruitment process was deliberately unconventional, focusing not on parade ground discipline but on initiative, resourcefulness, and the ability to operate independently. Many were misfits in the traditional military structure, men who chafed under rigid command hierarchies, who questioned orders, who preferred action to procedure. In a conventional unit, such men were problems. In the SAS, they were assets. The training was brutal, designed to eliminate anyone who lacked the physical stamina or mental resilience for operations that might last days behind enemy lines with no support. Men marched across the desert carrying full combat loads, learning to navigate by the stars, to conserve water, to function effectively in temperatures that exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and dropped near freezing at night. They learned demolitions, how to place charges for maximum damage, how to improvise explosives from captured materials, how to destroy aircraft, vehicles, and fuel dumps with minimal equipment. They learned to drive jeeps at high speed across broken terrain at night without headlights. They learned to shoot instinctively without aiming, because most engagements would occur at close range in poor visibility. But more than any specific skill, they learned to think differently about warfare. Traditional military doctrine emphasized concentration of force, hierarchical command, set-piece battles between clearly defined units. The SAS rejected all of that. They operated in small teams, usually 4 to 8 men, with minimal command oversight. Each team was expected to exercise initiative, to adapt to changing circumstances, to make decisions without waiting for orders. The goal was not to hold territory or to destroy the enemy's army. The goal was to create maximum disruption with minimum resources, to force the enemy to divert forces to protect vulnerable targets, to operate inside the enemy's decision-making cycle, so they were always reacting rather than acting. For the German soldiers who faced them, or more accurately, who discovered the results of their raids, the SAS represented something deeply unsettling. The Wehrmacht had built its success on the blitzkrieg concept, on speed and coordination and the massing of forces at decisive points. They understood conventional warfare. They excelled at it. But the SAS operated outside those conventions. They appeared from nowhere, struck with devastating efficiency, and disappeared before a proper response could be organized. They did not fight to hold ground. They fought to create chaos and then vanished into the desert vastness. German operational reports from 1942 convey a growing frustration with this new threat. One Luftwaffe commander, attempting to explain to his superiors how an airfield 150 miles behind the front lines had lost 23 aircraft in a single night, wrote, "The enemy raiders demonstrated complete familiarity with our dispositions. They avoided our guard posts and struck at the precise moment when our personnel were least prepared. By the time our forces organized a response, the attackers had withdrawn. The raid displayed professional planning and execution that suggests specialized training. We must consider that the enemy has developed new tactical capabilities, specifically designed to exploit the vulnerabilities of rear area installations." The frustration was understandable. The German military prided itself on tactical superiority, on professional competence, on the ability to outthink and outmaneuver opponents. But against the SAS, those advantages meant nothing. You could not outmaneuver an enemy who struck and withdrew before you knew they were there. You could not demonstrate tactical superiority against an opponent who refused to engage in conventional combat. The SAS had found a seam in the German military system, the assumption that rear areas were secure, that only the front lines required heavy defenses, and they exploited it ruthlessly. By July 1942, the SAS had expanded significantly. What began as fewer than 70 men had grown to over 300, organized into multiple squadrons. They had established a forward base at Siwa Oasis deep in the desert, from which they could launch operations across the breadth of German-held Libya. Their jeeps, modified with additional fuel tanks and weapons mounts, could travel hundreds of miles between raids. They had developed supply networks, intelligence sources, and navigation techniques that allowed them to operate almost continuously. The SAS had become, in effect, a permanent threat behind German lines, a strategic asset that tied down disproportionate enemy resources. German commanders faced an impossible dilemma. If they concentrated their aircraft at a few heavily defended airfields, they reduced the SAS threat, but also reduced operational flexibility and created lucrative targets for conventional bombing. If they dispersed aircraft across many smaller airfields, they made each target less valuable, but also made comprehensive defense impossible. If they devoted significant forces to airfield security, those forces were unavailable for frontline operations. Whatever choice they made, the British benefited. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the Luftwaffe commander responsible for Mediterranean operations, recognized the strategic problem. In a July 1942 report to Berlin, he wrote, "The British raiding forces have achieved an effect entirely disproportionate to their numbers. The material losses, while significant, are less concerning than the operational disruption. We have been forced to implement security measures that reduce aircraft availability and sortie rates. Pilots and ground crews previously focused entirely on combat operations must now maintain vigilance against ground attack. The psychological effect cannot be quantified but is substantial. Our airfields, previously considered secure, are now known to be vulnerable. This knowledge affects behavior and decision-making at all levels." Kesselring was describing something that would later be called asymmetric warfare, the use of unconventional tactics by a weaker force to negate the advantages of a stronger opponent. The Luftwaffe in North Africa was numerically and technically superior to the RAF. In conventional air combat, German pilots and aircraft generally prevailed. But the SAS had made conventional air combat irrelevant. They were destroying aircraft on the ground, where technical superiority and pilot skill meant nothing. And they were doing it at a cost, both material and human, that was absurdly favorable. A single SAS raid might cost one jeep and perhaps a few casualties. That same raid might destroy 20 aircraft, each of which represented more resources than the entire raiding team. The mathematics were unsustainable for the Germans. The Luftwaffe could not replace aircraft as quickly as the SAS could destroy them, not when those aircraft also had to be shipped across the Mediterranean through waters increasingly dominated by Allied naval and air forces. Every Messerschmitt lost at Sidi Hanish or Benghazi or Tobruk was one fewer aircraft available for combat operations. And the losses were cumulative. The steady attrition of aircraft forced the Luftwaffe to reduce sortie rates, which gave the RAF more operational freedom, which allowed the British to rebuild their own air strength. The Sidi Hanish raid on July 26, 1942, represented the culmination of the SAS's development as a military force. It was their largest operation to date, 18 jeeps carrying approximately 60 men, supported by additional vehicles carrying fuel and ammunition. The operational planning had taken weeks. Intelligence sources had identified Sidi Hanish as a major Luftwaffe staging base, home to over 100 aircraft from multiple units. The airfield's location, only 50 miles behind the front lines but still considered secure, made it a critical logistics hub. Striking it successfully would not only destroy aircraft but would disrupt German air operations along the entire front. The raid force departed from Siwa Oasis on July 24th, traveling at night to avoid detection and observation. They covered nearly 200 miles of desert, navigating by compass and stars, stopping during daylight to hide under camouflage nets. The navigation was handled by LRDG guides, men who knew the desert with an intimacy that seemed almost supernatural. They could read the land like sailors read the sea, recognizing subtle changes in terrain, knowing where to find the rare water sources, understanding how to move across the desert without leaving tracks that German reconnaissance aircraft might spot. As they approached the target area on the night of July 26th, Sterling made a final reconnaissance. Moving forward on foot with 2 men, he observed the airfield from a low ridge approximately 2 miles distant. What he saw must have seemed almost too good to be true. The aircraft were parked in neat rows, perfectly spaced, completely unguarded. There were no defensive positions between the raiders' approach route and the airfield. The Germans had sentries, but they were positioned to watch the main access roads, not the open desert. The entire base was oriented toward threats from the air or from the conventional front lines. It was not prepared for an attack from the deep desert, exactly as Sterling had predicted. The raid itself unfolded with a violence that was both controlled and overwhelming. The jeeps approached in two columns, timing their arrival to hit the airfield from two directions simultaneously. The principle was simple: saturate the Germans with more targets than they could engage, more threats than they could process. Create such complete chaos that organized resistance became impossible. And it worked. The German defenders, jolted awake by the sound of engines and gunfire, stumbled into darkness trying to understand what was happening. By the time they reached defensive positions, the raiders had already swept through half the airfield. Sergeant Major Johnny Cooper, one of Sterling's most experienced raiders, later described the sensation. Time slowed down and sped up at the same moment. We were moving fast, 40 miles per hour across the airfield, but I could see every detail. Each aircraft we passed, each fuel tank that ruptured, each incendiary that caught. The Germans were firing back, but they were shooting at shadows at the sound of our engines. We knew exactly where we were going. They had no idea where we were. That advantage, that certainty versus confusion, that's what made it work. The precision was remarkable. Despite the chaos and speed, the SAS teams achieved near-perfect coordination. Each jeep had assigned sectors, specific rows of aircraft to engage. The machine gunners fired in controlled bursts, long enough to cause catastrophic damage, short enough to conserve ammunition. The bomb throwers aimed for fuel tanks and engine compartments, the aircraft's most vulnerable points. There was no random spraying of fire, no wasted effort. Every action had purpose. The raiders had practiced this so many times that even in darkness, under fire, they executed their roles with mechanical efficiency. The Germans, by contrast, were trapped in confusion. The suddenness of the attack, the speed of the raiders, the multiple simultaneous threats, all of it created a decision-making paralysis. Should they defend the aircraft or take cover? Should they try to organize at the defensive positions or counterattack immediately? Should they call for reinforcements or assume this was a diversionary attack preceding something larger? In the time it took German officers to process these questions, the raid was already over. The immediate material damage was devastating. Post-raid assessments by British intelligence, corroborated later by captured German records, indicated that the SAS destroyed between 37 and 40 aircraft that night. The exact number varied depending on whether one counted aircraft damaged beyond repair versus those actually burning. But the more significant impact was operational. Sidi Hanaish had been a critical staging point for German air operations supporting Rommel's forces at El Alamein. Its sudden loss forced the Luftwaffe to redistribute aircraft to more distant airfields, which increased flying time to the front lines, which reduced sortie rates, which meant fewer German aircraft available over the battlefield. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe rippled through the entire North African theater. If Sidi Hanaish, a major base close to the front lines, presumably secure, could be destroyed in 12 minutes by a handful of jeeps, then no airfield was safe. German commanders began implementing security measures that bordered on paranoia. Guard posts proliferated. Patrols increased. Aircraft had to be dispersed and dispersed again. Luftwaffe ground crews, already stretched thin by the demands of maintaining aircraft in harsh desert conditions, now had to pull guard duty and construct defensive positions. Pilots who should have been resting between missions found themselves standing watch. All of this reduced operational efficiency. A captured German logistics officer, interrogated in August 1942, provided insight into the cascading effects. After the Sidi Hanaish raid, we received orders to fortify every airfield perimeter. We needed wire, sandbags, concrete for bunkers. All of this had to be shipped from Europe, competing for transport space with fuel, ammunition, spare parts. The construction work required labor, German engineers who could have been building defensive positions at the front. And even after we built these defenses, there was never confidence they would work. The British had proven they could penetrate wherever they wished. We were securing against a threat we did not fully understand and could not reliably predict. This last point, the inability to predict or prevent SAS attacks, was perhaps the most corrosive element. The Wehrmacht had built its reputation on competence, on the ability to analyze enemy capabilities and develop effective countermeasures. But against the SAS, that analytical process failed. The raiders struck from unexpected directions at unexpected times against unexpected targets. There was no pattern to exploit, no predictability to build defenses around. The SAS had mastered the art of creating uncertainty, and uncertainty is poisonous to military operations. Rommel himself, focused on the ground campaign at El Alamein, nevertheless felt the effects. His offensive plans depended on Luftwaffe air superiority to suppress British artillery and interdict supply lines. But after Sidi Hanish and the string of successful SAS raids that preceded it, that air superiority was increasingly unreliable. German fighter squadrons that should have had 30 operational aircraft could field only 20. Bomber units that should have been flying 2 missions daily could manage only 1. The cumulative attrition of aircraft, combined with the operational disruptions caused by security requirements, meant that the Luftwaffe was slowly losing the air war in North Africa, not through dramatic combat losses, but through the steady erosion of capability. But material and operational effects, significant as they were, did not capture the full impact of what the SAS had achieved. The deeper significance lay in what the raids revealed about the nature of modern warfare and the vulnerability of sophisticated military systems to unconventional approaches. The German military machine in 1942 was arguably the most professional, technically advanced armed force in the world. German officers were superbly trained in operational planning and tactical execution. German soldiers were disciplined, experienced, capable. German equipment, the aircraft destroyed at Sidi Hanish, for example, represented cutting-edge technology. By conventional measures, the Wehrmacht was superior to its British opponents in nearly every category. And yet a few dozen men in jeeps operating outside conventional military doctrine had achieved strategic effects that entire British divisions could not accomplish. This reality created a profound cognitive dissonance within the German command structure. How could the inferior British, who had been defeated in France, who had been pushed across North Africa, who lost battles with dispiriting regularity, suddenly develop a capability that the Wehrmacht could not counter? The answer, though few German officers could fully articulate it, was that the SAS represented a different kind of military thinking. British conventional forces might be inferior in training, equipment, and tactical doctrine, but the SAS operated in a different space entirely, one where conventional advantages were irrelevant. David Stirling understood this intuitively. In a memorandum written in late 1942, describing the SAS's operational philosophy, he wrote, "The essence of successful irregular operations lies not in superior force but in superior understanding. We do not seek to outfight the enemy in conventional terms. We seek to identify asymmetries, points where the enemy is systematically vulnerable, and exploit them before the enemy recognizes the vulnerability exists." The German military is oriented toward large-scale conventional operations. Their airfields are defended against air attack and frontal assault. They are not defended against infiltration and hit-and-run tactics because their doctrine does not anticipate such threats. This is not stupidity. It is the natural result of optimizing for one type of warfare. Our advantage lies in fighting a different type of warfare entirely. This was revolutionary military thinking, though its revolutionary nature would not be fully appreciated until decades later. Stirling was articulating what would eventually be called effects-based operations, focusing not on destroying enemy forces directly, but on creating specific effects that achieved strategic goals. The goal was not to destroy the Luftwaffe as an organization, but to degrade its operational effectiveness. The goal was not to conquer territory, but to create conditions where the enemy could not effectively use the territory they held. The goal was not to win battles, but to make the enemy's advantages irrelevant. The Jeep, the vehicle that made the Sidi Hanish raid possible, became a symbol of this new approach. The German military favored heavy, specialized vehicles. Their half-tracks were robust and capable, but required extensive maintenance. Their staff cars were purpose-built for command functions. Everything was optimized for specific roles within a hierarchical system. The SAS Jeep, by contrast, was crude, simple, and magnificently versatile. It could carry weapons, supplies, fuel. It could traverse terrain that would stop heavier vehicles. It required minimal maintenance and could be repaired with basic tools. If one broke down, the crew could transfer to another or simply walk. There was nothing special about the Jeep itself. It was an American design, mass-produced, decidedly unglamorous, but in the hands of the SAS, the humble Jeep became a strategic weapon. It enabled speed, mobility, and operational range that sophisticated German vehicles could not match. It allowed the SAS to operate continuously across hundreds of miles of desert. It made possible the kind of rapid strike that had devastated Sidi Hanesh. The Jeep was not superior to German vehicles in any technical sense, but it was optimized for the mission the SAS needed to accomplish. And that mission-specific optimization mattered more than technical sophistication. German soldiers, surveying the wreckage after SAS raids, often found shell casings from the Vickers K guns and fragments from the Lewis bombs. These were not cutting-edge weapons. The Vickers K was an obsolete aircraft gun. The Lewis bombs were crude incendiaries. By German engineering standards, they were almost primitive. And yet they had destroyed Messerschmitts and Junkers, aircraft that represented the pinnacle of German aeronautical engineering. The contrast was stark and unsettling. Crude weapons, simple vehicles, irregular tactics, all of it achieving results that conventional forces with superior equipment could not match. The transformation in British military thinking that the SAS represented was not universally welcomed. Many senior British officers viewed Sterling and his unconventional methods with suspicion. The SAS drew resources and personnel from regular units. They operated independently, answering to almost no one. They achieved dramatic results, but did so outside the command structures that generals understood and controlled. Some officers argued that the SAS should be disbanded. Their men returned to conventional units where discipline and coordination could be properly enforced. But the results were undeniable. By late 1942, the SAS had destroyed or damaged over 250 Axis aircraft, more than the RAF had destroyed in air-to-air combat over the same period. They had done this with casualties of fewer than 50 men killed or captured. The cost-effectiveness was staggering. A conventional bombing raid might involve dozens of aircraft, hundreds of crew members, the consumption of thousands of gallons of fuel, and achieve the destruction of a handful of targets while suffering significant losses. A single SAS raid might involve 20 men and 5 jeeps, destroy 20 aircraft, and suffer no losses at all. General Bernard Montgomery, taking command of the 8th Army in August 1942, recognized the SAS's strategic value. Unlike some of his predecessors, Montgomery understood that the coming battle at El Alamein would require more than conventional force-on-force engagement. He needed every advantage he could create. The SAS, operating behind German lines, could provide those advantages, not by destroying Rommel's army directly, but by degrading the supporting systems that kept that army effective. Montgomery gave Sterling free rein to continue operations, expanding the SAS further and providing them with additional resources. The period between July and October 1942, the months leading up to the decisive Second Battle of El Alamein, saw the SAS at its peak effectiveness. Raid followed raid. Airfields, supply depots, communication centers, fuel dumps all became targets. The raids were not random harassment. They were carefully planned to create maximum disruption to German operations. When intelligence indicated that Rommel was massing forces for an offensive, the SAS struck the airfields that would support that offensive. When German supply convoys were identified, SAS teams ambushed them. The effect was cumulative, each raid adding to the others, creating a constant background of disruption and loss that the Germans could not prevent and could not ignore. A German intelligence assessment from September 1942, captured later in the war, provides a remarkably candid evaluation. The British raiding forces have achieved a dominant position in the deep desert. Our attempts to counter their operations have proven largely ineffective. Their mobility exceeds our ability to intercept. Their intelligence regarding our dispositions suggests comprehensive reconnaissance capabilities. Most concerning is the operational effect. Our forces are forced to maintain extensive rear area security, reducing combat power at the front. Air operations are continually disrupted. Supply lines are under constant threat. The raiders themselves number perhaps 300 men. Yet they have created effects that would normally require an entire division to achieve. We have no effective counter-strategy. The last sentence was the most damning. We have no effective counter-strategy. The Wehrmacht, which prided itself on tactical flexibility and operational excellence, had been confronted with a problem it could not solve. The SAS operated inside the Germans' decision-making cycle. By the time German commanders recognized a threat and organized a response, the SAS had already struck and withdrawn. The Germans could reinforce security at one airfield, but that left 20 others vulnerable. They could increase patrols, but the desert was too vast and the SAS too mobile. They could develop intelligence on SAS operations, but by the time that intelligence was processed and disseminated, the situation had changed. The Second Battle of El Alamein, beginning on October 23, 1942, would prove to be the turning point of the North African campaign. Montgomery's 8th Army broke through German defenses and sent Rommel's forces into retreat, a retreat that would continue, with occasional pauses, all the way across Libya and Tunisia until the final Axis surrender in May 1943. Historians analyzing El Alamein typically focus on Montgomery's meticulous planning, on the superiority of Allied armor and artillery, on the code-breaking intelligence that revealed German dispositions. But those same historians often overlook the contribution of the SAS. During the critical weeks of the El Alamein battle, the Luftwaffe proved unable to contest British air superiority effectively. German fighter squadrons were understrength, many of their aircraft having been destroyed in SAS raids over the preceding months. German bomber units, which should have been striking British supply lines and troop concentrations, were instead conserving strength and operating from distant airfields where security could be maintained. The Luftwaffe's reduced effectiveness gave the RAF freedom to operate, which allowed British artillery spotting aircraft to direct devastating fire onto German positions, which allowed British fighters and bombers to interdict German supply columns without serious opposition. The causal chain was clear, even if difficult to quantify precisely. SAS raids destroyed German aircraft and disrupted Luftwaffe operations. Reduced Luftwaffe effectiveness gave the RAF air superiority. Air superiority enabled British ground forces to operate more effectively. More effective ground operations led to the breakthrough at El Alamein. The SAS had not won the battle directly. They had created conditions that made British victory possible. This was strategic effect achieved through unconventional means, exactly what Stirling had envisioned. After El Alamein, as Allied forces pursued the retreating Germans across North Africa, the SAS continued operations. They evolved again, adapting to the changing strategic situation. They began conducting longer-range raids, penetrating deep into Axis-held territory to strike targets in Tunisia and even southern Europe. They coordinated with resistance groups, multiplying their effectiveness through local support. And critically, they began training new units, passing on their techniques, their operational methods, their unconventional thinking to other British forces and eventually to American Special Operations units being formed for operations in Europe. The SAS model, small, highly trained teams conducting deep penetration raids against high-value targets, would become a template for special operations forces worldwide. The American Rangers, the later Green Berets, the German KSK, the Australian SASR, all would trace their conceptual lineage back to what Stirling and the SAS created in the North African desert. The idea that small, unconventional forces could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their size, once considered radical, would become accepted doctrine. But for the Germans who experienced the SAS raids, the lasting impact was not doctrinal or theoretical. It was visceral and permanent. They had been confronted with an enemy that did not fight by the rules they understood, that appeared from nowhere and vanished into nothing, that turned their strongest defensive positions into liabilities. The experience shook German confidence in a way that conventional military defeats did not. One Luftwaffe ground crew chief interviewed after the war captured this psychological dimension. After the raid started, everything changed. Before we felt secure. We were far from the front. We had guards, anti-aircraft guns. We believed we were safe. After the first raid, that belief was gone. We never knew when they would come. Night duty became an ordeal. Every sound in the darkness could be them. Some men became obsessed with watching the desert, convinced they saw movement where there was none. Others became fatalistic, believing that if the raiders wanted to attack, no defense would stop them. The fear was not of being killed. Most of us accepted that risk. The fear was of being helpless, of knowing that our security was an illusion, that we could do everything right and still be destroyed. This was the deeper wound the SAS inflicted, the destruction of certainty. The Wehrmacht had operated with confidence born of success. They had conquered most of Europe. They had defeated opponents who outnumbered them. They believed in their superiority, not through propaganda but through tangible victories. The SAS attacks challenged that belief in a way that conventional defeats could not. Losing a battle could be explained. The enemy had more forces, better positioning, good luck. But being raided repeatedly by forces that appeared and disappeared at will, suffering continuous losses without being able to prevent or adequately respond, that could not be easily explained within the Germans' self-conception as superior soldiers. The Jeep, that crude, simple vehicle, became a symbol of this psychological defeat. German soldiers would hear engines in the night and feel fear, uncertain whether the sound was friendly vehicles or SAS raiders. The sight of dust clouds on the horizon created anxiety. Was that a supply column or an attack force? The Jeep, which had no particular attributes that should have inspired fear, became associated with sudden, overwhelming violence from unexpected directions. It represented the impossibility of security, the failure of German military systems to protect even rear area installations. After the war, when military historians interviewed former SAS members about the Jeep raids, many described a sense of almost surreal power during the attacks. Sergeant Reg Seekings recalled, "You'd see the Germans running, trying to organize, shouting orders, and you'd drive past them knowing they couldn't stop you. They had more men, more weapons, more everything, but none of it mattered because we had speed and surprise. For those few minutes we were invincible, not because of our equipment. We knew a single lucky shot could kill us, but because we understood the situation and they didn't. We had seized control of time itself. They were reacting. We were acting. And in that gap between action and reaction, we did our work." This control of initiative, this ability to operate inside the enemy's decision-making process, would become a central principle of modern special operations doctrine. But in 1942 in the North African desert, it was new and terrifying. The Germans could not adapt quickly enough because adaptation requires understanding the threat, and the SAS deliberately created situations that defied understanding. Each raid was different. Each approach route was new. Each target was selected according to intelligence the Germans did not know had been compromised. The Germans were fighting blind, always responding to the last attack while the next one was already being planned. The ultimate failure of the Luftwaffe in North Africa cannot be attributed solely to the SAS. German air power faced many challenges. The increasing strength of the RAF, the difficulties of resupplying across the Mediterranean, the broader strategic problems facing the entire North African campaign. But the SAS created a multiplier effect on all these other factors. Each aircraft destroyed on the ground was one less aircraft available for combat. Each disrupted airfield operation reduced sortie rates. Each diversion of resources to rear area security weakened the frontline forces. And beyond the material effects, the SAS demonstrated a fundamental truth that the German military establishment struggled to accept, that technological and tactical superiority could be negated by unconventional approaches. The Luftwaffe had better aircraft than the RAF in many respects. German pilots were highly trained and experienced. German tactics were sophisticated, but none of that mattered when the aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could take off. The Germans had optimized for one type of warfare and found themselves fighting a different type entirely, one where their optimizations became vulnerabilities. The captured German intelligence assessment that admitted we have no effective counter-strategy was an extraordinary confession of intellectual defeat. The Wehrmacht's entire institutional culture was built on tactical problem-solving, on analyzing enemy capabilities and developing counters. But against the SAS, that analytical process failed. The problem set was too fluid, too adaptive, too fundamentally different from what German doctrine prepared them for. By the time they developed security measures for one type of SAS raid, the SAS had evolved to a different approach. The Germans were always fighting the last raid while the SAS was planning the next. Innovation. This intellectual defeat, perhaps more than the material losses, ensured that the Luftwaffe would never recover its position in North Africa. An army can replace lost equipment if it maintains confidence in its methods and leadership. But when the fundamental assumptions about warfare are challenged, when the institutional knowledge proves inadequate, recovery becomes much more difficult. The Luftwaffe did not just lose aircraft to the SAS. It lost certainty, confidence, and the psychological initiative. Those losses could not be replaced by manufacturing more Messerschmitts. In the years following the North African campaign, the SAS would expand dramatically, conducting operations in Italy, France, Germany, and beyond. David Stirling himself was captured in January 1943 and spent the rest of the war in German POW camps. Though even in captivity, the Germans feared him enough to hold him in high-security facilities and transfer him repeatedly to prevent escape attempts. But the organization he created continued without him, the principles he established becoming foundational to special operations worldwide. The jeep raids that devastated Sidi Hanaish and dozens of other Luftwaffe airfields became legendary within military circles. They were studied at staff colleges, analyzed in tactical journals, held up as examples of innovative thinking in warfare. The humble Willys Jeep, mass-produced, utterly common, technically unremarkable, entered military mythology. After the war, similar vehicles would be used by special operations forces worldwide, always carrying the implicit heritage of those North African raids. But the deeper legacy was conceptual. The SAS proved that small, highly trained, unconventional forces could achieve strategic effects that conventional forces could not match. They demonstrated that understanding the enemy's systematic vulnerabilities was more valuable than possessing superior force. They showed that mobility, initiative, and operational surprise could offset almost any disadvantage in numbers or equipment. These lessons would shape military thinking for generations. For the Germans, the legacy was darker. The failure to counter the SAS represented a broader failure of the German military system. Its rigidity, its inability to adapt to truly novel threats, its tendency to optimize for known problems while ignoring emergent ones. The same institutional characteristics that made the Wehrmacht so effective in conventional operations made it vulnerable to unconventional approaches. The SAS had found that vulnerability and exploited it with ruthless efficiency. The burning aircraft at Sidi Hanaish, those million Reichsmark fighters reduced to twisted metal and ash in 12 minutes, stood as monuments to that vulnerability. They represented not just material loss, but intellectual defeat. The Wehrmacht had been outthought, not just outfought. And in total war, intellectual defeat is ultimately more catastrophic than tactical defeats on the battlefield. There is a photograph, taken by an SAS raider during one of the jeep raids in late 1942. It shows a German Messerschmitt 109 engulfed in flames, the fire bright enough to illuminate the surrounding darkness. In the foreground, partially visible, is the hood of a jeep, scratched, sandblasted, utterly utilitarian. The contrast between the sophisticated fighter aircraft and the crude vehicle is stark. The Messerschmitt represents thousands of hours of engineering work, precision manufacturing, the concentrated industrial might of the Reich. The jeep represents mass production, practicality, simplicity of purpose. In that single image lies the story of the SAS's war against the Luftwaffe. Sophistication defeated by simplicity. Technical excellence negated by tactical innovation. The strongest defensive positions rendered irrelevant by approaches that ignored conventional engagement rules. The photograph captures a moment, but it symbolizes a transformation in warfare itself. The realization that in modern conflict, victory does not always belong to those with the best equipment or the most soldiers, but to those who can think differently about how to apply force. The Germans at Sidi Hanaish had expected their airfield to be secure. They were far behind the lines. They had guards and weapons. They had the full might of the Wehrmacht protecting them. What they experienced instead was 12 minutes of controlled violence that destroyed 40 aircraft and shattered the illusion of security. They learned in the most visceral way possible that the rules they understood no longer fully applied. That the enemy they faced had discovered new rules, new methods, new ways of creating effects, and they never recovered from that lesson. The Luftwaffe in North Africa grew progressively weaker, not because it stopped fighting, But because it could not fight effectively while simultaneously defending against a threat, it could not predict or prevent. The SAS had achieved what conventional forces could not. They had neutralized German air superiority through a combination of audacity, innovation, and relentless operational pressure. The Jeep, that simple, rugged, utterly unsexy vehicle, became the symbol of democratic warfare at its most effective. Not through technical superiority, but through mass production, versatility, and the empowerment of small teams to exercise initiative. The Jeep did not need to be perfect. It needed to be good enough, reliable, and available in numbers that allowed continuous operations. This was fundamentally different from the German approach, which sought perfection in individual systems while ignoring sustainability and operational endurance. When the war ended and militaries worldwide analyzed what had worked and what had failed, the SAS Jeep raid stood out as a case study in asymmetric effectiveness. Small investments in unconventional capabilities had yielded strategic returns. Simple equipment brilliantly employed had defeated sophisticated systems. The lesson was clear. Innovation in how you fight matters more than superiority in what you fight with. The Germans had built their military around the concept of qualitative superiority. Better training, better equipment, better tactics. The SAS had proven that qualitative superiority could be rendered irrelevant by fighting in ways that negated those advantages. You did not need a better aircraft if you could destroy the enemy's aircraft on the ground. You did not need superior tank forces if you could eliminate enemy air support. You did not need to win conventional battles if you could degrade the enemy's ability to fight those battles effectively. This was the truth written in fire on the tarmac at Sidi Hanesh. That warfare had evolved beyond the simple calculus of who had more or better weapons. The side that could adapt, innovate, and operate outside conventional frameworks held profound advantages. The side that remained bound by doctrine, by assumptions, by what had worked in the past, would find those strengths becoming vulnerabilities. The Luftwaffe never recovered from the SAS campaigns because it could not adapt quickly enough to a threat that operated outside its conceptual framework. By the time German commanders fully understood what they were facing, the strategic situation had shifted irrevocably. The moment of air superiority had passed. The window for victory in North Africa had closed. And across the desert, in dozens of destroyed airfields, the wreckage of sophisticated aircraft stood as testament to the power of unconventional thinking in the hands of determined, innovative fighters. 12 minutes at Sidi Hanesh, 40 aircraft destroyed, and with them, the myth of German invincibility and the assumption that technological superiority alone could guarantee victory. The SAS had driven into that airfield and driven out again, leaving behind not just material destruction, but a permanent challenge to how modern warfare would be understood. The humble Jeep had defeated the mighty Luftwaffe, and nothing in military thinking would ever be quite the same.